Hello, everyone. I'm back talking with a great friend of mine, Paul Hobcraft, who has done a lot of joint development with me on some ideas around innovation. I'll let Paul introduce himself for just a moment.
Hi, Jeffrey and I have known each other now for a good number of years. And he said we've had some great collaborations. Um, we're always battling backwards and forwards about thoughts and ideas and innovation because we've both been at it for a long time, maybe too long. But the value we've both got is a lot of experience over many years working with a lot of clients. And we want to share some of that value with you today.
So, Paul,
Jeffrey.
one of the things that you and I were talking about before we started recording is the idea of divergence and convergence and how important that is as an innovation tool. However, one of the things that we believe is that there might be too much divergence in the innovation space. Could you clarify what kind of divergence there is and why we might want to converge around a few things?
Yeah, look, I love divergence convergence because it allows everybody potentially in the same room to air their opinion. That's a divergence potential. So once you get that, if you can begin to actually understand where people are, what the issues they need to discuss, you can start moving towards convergence. But to get to that, you need building blocks of understanding. And that's what Jeffrey and I have been talking about for quite a long time is what are the building blocks that you need around the getting from diverging into converging? Jeffrey, do you want to kick off on that?
Well, I love the idea because I do think there's a lot of divergence right now. And sometimes I think it's divergence that creates confusion rather than clarity. And so, one of the other things that you and I were talking about is no business does anything without defining a set of frameworks, a set of methods, a set of knowledge or capabilities. And we think innovation should be the same way. And so, I know you and I have knocked this idea around together around the idea of getting back to the basics, getting back to some core principles because I think a lot of companies are trying to run before they've learned to crawl or walk. That is, they're trying to take on these really complex innovation processes, methods, tools, without having those fundamental building blocks that Paul, you were talking about. So let's talk
And I,
about what a few of those are.
yeah, and I think what you just said, Jeffrey, is we need to strip away that tension. There's a lot of tension because there's a lot of confusion. And because of the so many choices you've got, so many people come into the room with so many different things, you've got to strip it away. You've got to get back to those basic points of real understanding between people. So yeah, I'm 100% with you that we strip away all of these lots of tools that are around, there's lots of tension, and I believe we have a few good indicators of how to do that.
Well, the first one I know that I want to talk about, and I know is close to your heart, is the linkage between innovation and strategy. I think a lot of times that people think, in my opinion, I think people think innovation is a strategy. My argument has always been that innovation is an outcome of your strategy. How do you think about the relationship between innovation and strategy?
Yeah, I often think strategy is the weak link sometimes in innovation. Um, Weak link in the respect that so much innovation activity has its own legs, it has its own momentum. It forgets that what it's there to do is map back to the strategy of the business and what the
Mhm.
business is trying to achieve. So unless we close that gap between strategic and innovation and make those far more aligned, I really think we have major problems within organizations. And quite frankly, I think that's one of the biggest issues we've got.
I think you're right there. And I think another area where there's a linkage gap is in this idea of what you and I have framed as common language. I've sat in rooms and listened to executives talk about innovation, and they're talking about wildly different things. So I don't think there's enough investment in the idea of creating a way of speaking and talking about innovation in organizations to help propel the work forward. In fact, sometimes the words get in the way. Have you encountered that?
Yeah, I mean, I think today we're too what's too popular today is things like taxonomies. You know, you set about building up a taxonomy of innovation, or taxonomy of technology, or taxonomy of this, and definitions of that. Quite frankly, when you're in a divergence conversion conversation, common language begins to emerge. It becomes, if you're able to pick out and say, listen, you guys, you're actually all saying the same sort of thing, maybe with slightly different words. So let's establish something that's common to us all. And we do have a common place. If we're working all in the same company, there is a lot of common jargon. There's a lot of common sort of approaches. Let's build out on that so we don't lose time. We don't lose that value, because we want to build on that building block of language and putting it into the right context so we can shorten down the conversation into meaningful innovation, not meaningful arguments.
Right. You notice that Paul and I are talking about convergence here, convergence around a linkage between innovation and strategy, convergence around a common language. And there's another thing that I think that you and I talked a lot about, and that's governance. There's a lot of governance models in organizations that are good for their common projects and activities that are conducted all the time. But when you look at the kind of governance that an innovation project needs, it tends to be fairly different. And to try to use those old governance models on these new activities, I think can create confusion and conflict. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think in today's world, governance has become super important. But it's super important now with a big difference. And I think that big difference is it has to be far more resilient and it has to be far more sustaining. And when you build into your innovation governance, your sustaining view and your resilient view, you're building now a much stronger building block for innovation to move forward. And it's working on those and bringing those commonalities that run across your business now increasingly, sustainability, resilience, and you're building those into your innovation block as well. And that makes a huge difference in the way people can set about and look at things.
Yeah, I agree completely. The last area that you and I talked about before we came on together was structures and processes. And again, we're talking about different building blocks, communication, governance, and another area is structures and processes. I think that a lot of organizations think they've done a good job. Many people watching this will say, well, we have a process or we have an innovation structure, but I'm not sure it's really fully developed and developed in cohesion with the other things we're talking about. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, you could argue a number of different things. I mean, people argue today you should separate your innovation activity out and treat it as a separate part of your business. If you're in for this particular startup environment, etc., those have all got value. But one of the underlying things you need to do is you should not have a regimented process and a regimented strategy. In today's world, it has to be fluid. And it has to be very agile and it has to be flexible. So your processes and your structures don't get caught up in the old-fashioned way of saying, that's it, it's set in stone, it's set in concrete. It is something that's got to be constantly reviewed, constantly adapted. So one innovation activity you do may have a completely different process because it's got a different design. It's got a different set of people involved. You know, in a world where we're far more open, you will go to another company that has a very different way of thinking about innovation because, you know, they're a very technically orientated company. You can't apply your process to them. It will straitjacket the conversation. What you've got to do is allow them and yourselves to be able to open out building blocks of the innovation. And that's what I think is key when it comes to processes and strategies today. Keep them fluid.
Well, I think you and I have talked about at least 4 what we would consider to be sort of fundamental building blocks. And let's go back to the idea of divergence and convergence for a second. Until you converge and build these capabilities in your business, at least these 4 building blocks that we've talked about, it's going to be hard to sustain innovation over time and to do it well. So one of the things that you and I built is something called the work mat. And in the subsequent conversations, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these functions. Is there anything else you'd like to leave the group with before we end this conversation?
Yeah, 4 actually little points, Jeffrey. You must always give innovation shape. We're providing a framework that gives that basic shape. Secondly, you need to have the opportunity to have intervention and exchange, divergence, convergence. Number 3, you need clear linkages. And within our framework, within our work mat, we believe there are a number of very clear linkages. And the last one is, it's got to be a great communicative mechanism. It's a communication mechanism. It's, so if you've got good, solid building blocks, you build a foundation. And I know you share those, and which will be a few more besides.
Well, like you, I believe very strongly that we need to get back to the core, core sort of building blocks, the core pieces of evidence, the core capabilities, and build up from there. And again, earlier I talked about running before you walk. And in an innovation context, walking is building those internal capabilities that, as you pointed out, are tightly linked together. And then once those things are empowered and enabled together, then you're going to accelerate innovation. The last thing that I think that you said that's important, even before we came on the call, was divergence and convergence isn't a one-time activity. We should be constantly diverging and converging in this case, because as we do innovation, we're going to learn and we're going to grow those internal skills and capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, look, you don't keep slapping on paint on something that's not really good. By stripping away, and getting down to the basic structure, you will actually get a much better opportunity to rebuild it, re-engineer it, rediscuss it. And I believe through our work mat approach, you've got that. So we will, as you rightly say, diverge, converge, loop, diverge, converge, loop. And that's the world we live in today. It doesn't stop at converge. It actually begins again back into diverge, because we've advanced everything further along.
Well, I'm going to leave it here that we're going to have several follow-on conversations. We're going to look at least 3 or 4 of these topics that we've talked about in greater detail, some linkages to strategy, some of the governance that we think is important. We're also going to look at some strategies around processes and so forth. So do follow on in the next conversations. Paul, enjoyed speaking with you.
And you, Jeffrey, take good care.
Thank you.